Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Bridging the Gap webinar. During the presentation, our participants will be in a listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded. Wednesday, May 6, 2015. I would now like to turn the conference over to Andrea Moss. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Nandi, and thanks everybody for joining us today for another session in our Cause and Effect series. If you've joined us before, you know that there are several sessions in the series that you can take a look at. We've got all of our archives recorded. I will post that link in the chat box so that you can go visit those and catch up on anything that you've missed. But today we're going to be talking about Bridging the Gap, Allie's story, and along with that we sent out handouts last night. So check your email. Make sure you check your spam or junk folders as well. Sometimes attachments get sent there. You'll find the handouts for today's session along with the complete Allie's story case study. If you would like a certificate of participation, we do provide those upon request. It's a general certificate of participation. I'll post my email in the chat box so that you can get on the list for that. Also, you can use that same email if you did not get the handouts. You can use that same email, send it to me, and then I'll get you the handouts as Dr. Maccow gets going. And just to introduce Dr. Gloria Maccow, she is one of our assessment consultants here at Pearson. She was trained as a school psychologist at Texas A&M University and at the University of Florida. She worked for 2 years as supervisor of psychological services and for several years as a school psychologist with Guilford County Schools in North Carolina. She provided training for graduate students in the school psychology at Indiana State University and at Illinois State University, and she worked as a psychologist in private practice in Greensboro, North Carolina. Dr. Maccow, we're happy to have you today, and please begin when you're ready.
Thank you so much, Andrea, and welcome everybody. Again, we'd like to continue our discussion about why students are struggling and what we can do to help them succeed in the classroom. And today we want to join Allie's story. And I'm going to be using the handouts that you received, especially the one that includes most of the slides I'm going to show here today. I'm going to refer to the case study, and certainly at the end after the webinar, I encourage you to take a look at the case study for a more comprehensive discussion of the data that we're going to share. But for the next hour and a half or so, I want to look at the test results from the psychoeducational evaluation, and we want to ask ourselves 3 questions. First of all, why might it be that Allie did not respond in the direction we expected to the evidence-based interventions that we provided for reading? We also want to use the test data to determine whether or not Allie meets the criteria for classification of specific reading disability, sometimes referred to as dyslexia. And we also want to be able to identify any interventions that are needed to improve Allie's academic performance. As I'm talking about the basic referral information, and I think those of us who work with assessments or evaluations, as soon as we receive referral information, we already start generating hypotheses. So I want us to take a look at the reason for referral, at some of the background information, and as we're looking at those components, we'll start thinking about possible hypotheses and maybe assessment tools that would enable us to respond to those hypotheses, to confirm or refute our hypotheses. So I think just to start us out, Allie was referred for a psychoeducational evaluation by her mother, who was concerned about especially development in reading and spelling. Both her mother and her teachers described specific weaknesses in decoding, a sight word vocabulary, as well as reading accuracy and fluency, and spelling skills. So as soon as we see this information, we're starting to think maybe basic reading skills, whether you're thinking about about word recognition as evidenced by her sight word vocabulary, as well as decoding of unfamiliar words, and then also the spelling component. So I think the evaluation was pretty much focused on determining eligibility and need for direct specialized instruction, but also on trying to identify interventions that would be helpful as Allie is moving forward in the grades. I think just looking at this basic referral information, we could start generating some hypotheses. But whether or not we should be concerned about basic reading skills, I think might be best evaluated within a specific context. So I want to provide some context that will probably help us to refine our initial hypotheses. So I think to provide that context, let's think a little bit about who Allie is. Well, Allie is a 9-year-old girl who recently completed 4th grade. And think about what that additional piece of information would add to the hypotheses that we generated based on the referral information. She was adopted at the age of 11 months from a Russian orphanage and lives with her adoptive mother. Allie's adoptive mother describes Allie as a happy and loving child who is intellectually curious. She's responsible, creative, hardworking, compassionate. She gets along well with others. She's cooperative at home and school. She enjoys horseback riding. She enjoys fashion. But some of the things about which her mother is concerned would be the fact that Allie's easily distracted by sounds in her environment, and that she tends to need supervision to both initiate and complete her homework. So you want to start thinking about Allie in terms of these specific characteristics. Now, one piece of information that's really instructive to me here is when I think about the fact that she just completed 4th grade and this is now the summer, she'll be entering the 5th grade in the fall, I start thinking about especially the reading demands, the reading curriculum in 4th grade, and what would be the focus of the 4th grade reading curriculum, because I think that is what will help me to refine my hypotheses. So when we think about Allie's reading, I think reading difficulties were first identified when she was in kindergarten, and she started to receive tutoring with a reading specialist. By 3rd grade, she was receiving daily reading interventions with a reading specialist. So we'll look at the comments from the reading specialist to see how Allie is doing in the classroom now with these special interventions. She's now attending a public elementary school where she participates in a small group dyslexia intervention program, and she also receives private reading instruction twice a month. So when we ask the reading specialist to describe Allie's reading, the reading specialist tells us that Allie struggles with pronouncing new and unfamiliar words, oral reading accuracy, as well as her speed are concerns. She struggles with sound symbol associations, with spelling. She also struggles with writing letters quickly, with copying from the board, and with using good grammar and mechanics in writing. So again, you want to start thinking about this information. You're thinking about basic reading skills. Is it possible that a weakness in basic reading skills might be impacting her comprehension? What about the fine motor demands that are involved when you're writing letters quickly, when you're copying from the board? When you ask her mother, her mom describes that Allie tends to guess words based on the first few letters, which might tell us that the word is not part of her sight vocabulary. She doesn't recognize it immediately. She also transposes words within sentences, and she substitutes words to make sense with how she's reading the sentence. So maybe when you think about reading and the importance of the meaning code, it might be that Allie is relying on the meaning code as opposed to the sound symbol associations. Allie herself says that reading is difficult for her, that words tend to bunch up on the page. Also, there is an emotional component. She's embarrassed when she's asked to read aloud because she reads slowly. So all of this information really is helpful for us, but even more helpful, I think, is when we consider that in the typical classroom, the typical fourth grade classroom, the curriculum probably has now shifted to reading to learn. So the fact that children are expected to have mastered basic reading skills and to be able now to apply those basic reading skills might help us to understand why she's struggling with the grade level demands, because she is still learning to read in essence. But I think when we consider some of that information in conjunction with previous evaluations, again, all of this information helps us to generate and refine our hypotheses. So because her mother was concerned about the possibility of a learning disability, Allie was tested at school about 4 months before the current evaluation. That is evaluation 1. She was administered a brief intelligence test that measured both verbal and nonverbal abilities, and notice her score of 126 was in the superior range. This evaluation also documented average scores for decoding, fluency, comprehension, as well as phonological processing. The data did show weaknesses in spelling and handwriting. Again, handwriting and spelling are coming up over and over. So think about what we might hypothesize based on this information. Based on the overall evaluation of the data, it was determined that Allie did not qualify for special education services. She was tested subsequently through a nonprofit agency. That was evaluation 2, and that evaluation did document normative weaknesses in spelling as well as decoding fluency and oral reading fluency, which were in the average range on that school-based evaluation. And based on evaluation 2, the recommendation was made for eligibility or classification with a specific reading disorder or dyslexia. So I think the question that we want to ask is, first of all, what are our hypotheses? What do we already know about Allie? And we want to combine that information with what we know generally theoretically about what the good reader looks like. So what skills would characterize a good reader, and how would knowledge about reading and readers help us to generate hypotheses? So I want to take a quick look at the characteristics of the good reader, the struggling reader, and maybe the reader who is classified with a specific reading disability. I think when you think about reading, you want to think about both two components as important within reading. Good readers, and this is this second quadrant here, good readers are able to decode and comprehend. Struggling readers may struggle with reading either because of a weakness in decoding or in comprehension, or possibly in both. So a child whose decoding skills are adequate and whose comprehension skills are deficient might be diagnosed, depending on the data, with a nonspecific reading disability or hypothexia. That would be a child who is able to name words in isolation, but who struggles to respond to comprehension questions, whether literal or inferential. The other type of child, the other type of profile, might be a child whose decoding skills are deficient, but whose comprehension skills are adequate. That might be a child who might end up being diagnosed with a specific reading disability or dyslexia. So basic reading skills or decoding skills are a weakness, and theoretically a weakness in decoding skills might adversely impact comprehension, but given text that the child can decode, the child might be able to respond accurately to comprehension questions. And then you might have the child who struggles with both decoding and comprehension. And that would be a child who would struggle across curriculum areas. So that child might be described as the typical slow learner who learns at a slower rate than the typical child in the classroom. So we want to focus today on this child. We've already noted for Allie that Allie's concerned about decoding, so is the reading specialist, so is her mother. We don't know as much about comprehension, but I think based on the recommendation for a diagnosis of dyslexia from that second evaluation, we certainly want to focus on decoding skills as part of our evaluation. So what is dyslexia? I think when we think about dyslexia, we certainly want to consider the definition from the International Dyslexia Association that perceives or regards dyslexia first as a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin, and in the school setting that might be characterized, or the behavioral manifestations might be difficulties with word recognition, both accuracy and fluency, spelling, as well as decoding. So again, think about what we already know about Allie. Now, according to Sally Shaywitz and certainly the International Dyslexia Association, the deficit for dyslexia typically resides in the language system, more specifically the phonologic module or the phonological component of language. So you're thinking about a localized weakness in the phonological module that theoretically blocks decoding. Now, what you find with dyslexia is that the difficulties with decoding and possibly other areas are unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So for the most part, overall cognitive abilities are in the average, or at least the average range. But in spite of effective classroom instruction, the child continues to struggle with spelling and decoding. Now, secondary consequences may be a weakness in reading comprehension. So it is possible that the score on a measure of reading comprehension might be lower, but it is typically secondary to the decoding difficulties. But certainly when you're thinking about reduced reading experience, the less you're reading, the less you're able to learn new words. Certainly there is that direct and reciprocal relationship between comprehension and vocabulary. Good readers read more, learn new words. Poor readers read less and therefore don't learn as many new words. So certainly think about that interrelationship. So based on the totality of the information then, think about our hypotheses. What hypotheses can we generate? I hypothesize that Allie is struggling with grade level reading comprehension, and the reason that I'm focused on comprehension is because that theoretically is the grade level skill on which the 4th grade curriculum is focusing. Reading comprehension, I predict, the difficulties with reading comprehension are secondary to decoding difficulties. So based on this information now, I want to be able to select tools that will allow me to answer specific assessment questions. For example, is she learning at a slower rate than her classmates? Is her achievement unexpected relative to her cognitive abilities? Again, think about the definition from the International Dyslexia Association. And then in order to be able to link our assessment data to interventions or treatment, might it help us to understand which cognitive abilities are related to any identified underachievement? And then finally, which assessment instruments will help you to answer your questions? Now, when I think about assessment instruments, and I think about the fact that we're expecting theoretically that her overall ability to learn will be in the average range. And I'm also interested in trying to identify any cognitive abilities that are theoretically linked to reading decoding, to reading fluency, to spelling. I want to think about learning in general, and I want to conceive of learning as requiring the integration of multiple cognitive factors. So Dan Miller, in his book Essentials of Neuropsychological Assessment, refers to learning as a multifactorial process. So when you think about learning, think about sensory motor functions and attentional processes as the essential building blocks for all of the other higher order cognitive processes. So if there is a weakness in vision, visual acuity, or hearing acuity, visual discrimination, for example, fine and gross motor skills, if I'm struggling to focus and sustain my attention shifts, if any weaknesses at those levels will adversely impact my performance of these higher order cognitive abilities. But when you think about the way we receive information, certainly thinking about Baddeley and Hitch, we receive information through the phonological loop, that the language processes, receptive language, expressive language, certainly phonological processing, visual spatial processes. We process information through that visual spatial sketchpad. And memory and learning really require the integration of all of these components in order for me to learn and remember information. And then, of course, executive functions are an important component of the learning process, where you think about executive functions as the command and control center for all the other cognitive processes. And then certainly you would like me to integrate all of these processes quickly and efficiently in order for you to be able to describe my overall cognitive functioning as well as my academic achievement. Now, we're not going to talk very much today about social, emotional, cultural, environmental, and situational factors, but please understand that whenever we're looking at a cognitive profile, we must consider those social, emotional, cultural, and other factors. So think about selecting a battery of tests that would provide information about learning as a multifactorial process, and then become even more specific when you're thinking about the referral concern. What are the research-supported cognitive abilities that underlie performance, for example, of reading, decoding, and spelling in Allie's case? And so you think about what we know about research and reading-related processes. And I think certainly when you're thinking about the visual spatial skills that are part of the description I just shared from Dr. Dan Miller, when you think about learning to read, certainly phonological processing, rapid naming, visual spatial abilities are all associated with the development of early reading skills, to be able to name words in isolation, to be able to segment and blend. But when you think about reading decoding, certainly reading decoding is foundational to comprehension, but so is vocabulary level, and so is basic language understanding. So language comprehension is important as well. And then executive functions and working memory certainly facilitate reading, and fine motor skills are included as well, because often children who struggle especially with basic reading may have some coexisting conditions. We'll talk about that, maybe thinking about the weaknesses Allie is exhibiting in copying from the board and in writing. Also want to think about the cognitive processes that are specific to math or that underlie the performance of math. And I think the research that evaluates math disorder is less extensive. The research base is less extensive than the research base for reading. Certainly there is evidence for common cognitive difficulties between a math disorder and a reading disorder. So certainly attention, executive functions, language comprehension, and visual spatial processing, as well as working memory. I think really when you think working memory, all learning occurs in a working memory environment, and so a weakness in working memory theoretically will impact performance across content areas. So based on all that information, some of the information that we know specific to Allie and some information that we know based on our background knowledge, we selected several assessment instruments, and we wanted to evaluate general intellectual ability as well as specific abilities, and we chose the 5th edition of the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. We also wanted to confirm the academic weaknesses described by her teachers as well as by Allie and her mother, and for that we chose the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, the 3rd edition. And then we wanted to supplement those broad measures, one of ability and one of achievement, with some additional measures because we wanted to be able to verify some of Allie's scores on these broader measures. And we administered the Berry-Buktanica Developmental Test of Visual Motor Integration, the Berry VMI. We also administered a language measure, the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals, and selected subtests from the CEL-5. We also administered selected subtests from the NEPC-2 as well as from the 2nd edition of the Process Assessment of the Learner and from the WIAT-3, another achievement measure. So let's look at the evaluation results. And what we're looking for here really would be to see if there is a pattern of performance that would help us to understand the relationship between achievement scores and cognitive ability scores. So I want to start out first by looking at cognitive abilities. And I think the question that I ask here is whether or not she is capable of learning at the rate at which the teacher is presenting information in the classroom. So looking at general cognitive ability. And then I also want to look at the pattern. Are there personal cognitive strengths and weaknesses or intra-individual cognitive strengths and weaknesses? So I want to share with you the profile from the WISC-5, which is that general ability measure. Now, when we look at the scores here, I want to point out first that when you look at these primary index scores, there are 5: verbal comprehension, visual spatial, fluid reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. Her general ability or her overall ability to learn is within the average range. Her full scale IQ is 100. When I look at the pattern on the index scores, I notice that she demonstrated relative strengths in fluid reasoning and in processing speed. So these data tell me, looking at fluid reasoning, that her ability to abstract conceptual information from visual details when you think about matrix reasoning and figure weights, thinking about the ability to identify underlying conceptual rules, and then to apply that knowledge to maybe solve problems on matrix reasoning and on figure weights. Her ability, that ability is within the average range. When you think about processing speed is based on 2 subtests, 2 timed subtests, coding and symbol search. And again, her scores on the subtests are pretty consistent, suggesting that her ability to rapidly identify visual information and to make decisions quickly and rapidly and then to implement those decisions is within the high average range. So those are her relative strengths when you're looking at this profile. When I look at the other 3 indices, starting with verbal comprehension, notice that her verbal comprehension index is within the average range, but notice that the 2 subtest scores, a scale score of 12 for vocabulary and a scale score of 8 for similarities, the 4-point difference between those 2 subtest scores is significant and unusual. It occurred in probably about 6% of the normative sample. So taken together, these 2 scores would tell us that she certainly demonstrated good word knowledge. That's clear from her performance on vocabulary. But it appears as if there's a relative weakness in at least some aspects of verbal concept formation when you're thinking about the score on similarities. Again, keep in mind that pattern of performance. Again, when you look at visual spatial, the visual spatial index, again the overall index score of 97 in the average range. But again, take a look at the subtest scores, a scale score of 8 for block design, 11 for visual puzzles. Again, her score on visual puzzles is 3 scale score points higher. Although that difference score is not significant statistically, it might suggest or it might lead us to wonder if the output demand of the block design subtest, where she was required to use fine motor skills, those visual motor skills, to a greater extent than she did on visual puzzles, which required a pointing response, maybe we can hypothesize or wonder whether performance on block design was adversely impacted by a relative weakness in that visual motor demand. We will seek to verify that hypothesis later. The other index that I want to look at is working memory. So again, when you look at the pattern of performance, think about similarities, think about block design, and then let's look at working memory. And you see a similar pattern on the working memory index. Notice picture span that has that visual presentation versus digit span where the input and output demands are verbal. So, the verbal presentation by the clinician as well as the verbal response from Allie herself. And again, notice that there is a 4-point difference between these 4 scaled score points between digit span and picture span, again, which might lead us to wonder about whether the auditory demand of digit span might have adversely impacted her performance. Again, we'll seek to verify that later. I think I included 2 additional slides for you, and you could take a look at these where you can compare the score differences at the index level as well as the score differences at the subtest level. I think what I want to say about this is that when we look at the index level pairwise comparisons, even if the difference between 2 indices was statistically significant, as indicated by these Ys, those different scores were not clinically significant as indicated by the base rate. But when you look at the subtest level, again, notice that what I mentioned, similarities in vocabulary, that different score was significant and unusual, so was digit span and picture span. So I think what we wanted to do was to kind of get a sense based on our hypothesis for block design about whether or not visual motor adversely affected her performance on block design. So we administered some additional subtests, the BERI, the developmental test of visual motor integration, and notice her standard score of 86, which is relatively consistent with that scale score of 8 that she earned on the block design task. We also used her performance on the writing fluency subtest from the KTA-3. And again, when you look at her standard score of 79, percentile rank of 8, certainly I think that qualitative information is instructive. But if you use that quantitative information, in conjunction with this qualitative information here, again, consider that Allie is in 4th grade and you're thinking about the legibility of her handwriting, the formation of her letters. When she was asked to write the alphabet, she was able to write all of the letters of the alphabet, well, most of the letters of the alphabet. She consistently reversed the B and the D. And so I think we are somewhat concerned about maybe her output, the expressive demand, that written expressive demand. We also noted when she was holding her pencil, she did use an adaptive tripod grasp, so we're not concerned about the grasp. Still, I wonder if, as I'm looking at this information here, I should at least keep in the back of my mind whether or not we should consider referring for an OT evaluation so that we could get a better sense of her fine motor skills, because if she does qualify for direct specialized instruction, maybe we can provide occupational therapy as a related service. I'm just keeping that in the back of my mind. Now, when you look at the WISC-5 and you think about some of the additional indices for which you can calculate scores, certainly you really don't get much additional information from the General Ability Index and Cognitive Proficiency Index. And really, even the calculation of general ability and cognitive proficiency is not indicated when you look at those index level discrepancy comparisons. Like I said, even when the difference between a pair was significant statistically, it wasn't significant clinically. But what I do want to know is I probably want some additional information about another ancillary index, more specifically auditory working memory. Because when I compared digit span and picture span, I wondered whether the modality impacted her performance. And so you can calculate as an ancillary index the auditory working memory index, and notice that score is 89. It's based on the digit span, the score for digit span, and the score for letter number sequencing. So her overall score on auditory working memory is in the low average range. And when I look at her performance on digit span, I drill down even further to compare performance on the 3 conditions, the forward condition, backward condition, and sequencing condition. Notice that she performed better on sequencing than she did on forward. All 3 of these conditions require the child to register the information that he or she hears, to hold it in short-term memory, and then in the forward condition to repeat it, and on backward in sequencing to mentally manipulate or transform the information. Letter number sequencing that has the same demands as the digit span sequencing, notice that those scores are pretty consistent. But I also wanted to take a look at the quantitative reasoning index, which is within the average range. And the reason I wanted to look at that is because I also consider her score on arithmetic. Arithmetic, as you know, has a primary loading on the fluid reasoning index on WISC-5, but also has a secondary loading on working memory, specifically auditory working memory. And note that her score for arithmetic is pretty consistent with some of these other scores on the auditory working memory index. So again, some additional support for the fact that the modality probably explains to some extent her performance on working memory tasks. But we wanted to use some additional subtests in order to get a better sense of the modality in terms of attention and executive functioning. And so we administered 2 subtests from the NEPC-2, the animal sorting subtest, as well as the auditory attention and response set subtest. Now, animal sorting pretty much requires the child to sort pictures. So again, you're thinking about the input demand as being visual. But essentially, in order to complete that task correctly, the child engages conceptual reasoning, probably cognitive flexibility, as well as self-monitoring. Notice that Allie's scale score is 14 at the 91st percentile. However, when we compare that to her performance on tasks that measure auditory attention and response set, notice that her score for the auditory attention task, scale score of 7, for response set, scale score of 8. When you take her performance on these two subtests together, when you consider the scores together, we certainly recognize that she is capable of shifting cognitive set, especially with visual stimuli. But she did less well shifting and maintaining cognitive set on an auditory task. She also had difficulty sustaining auditory attention in the midst of distracting stimuli, which we heard from her mother as well. So again, think about this distinction when you're thinking about attention, executive function, and working memory, the distinction between the visual and the verbal modalities. The other thing that we want to consider when we think about a child who's struggling with reading certainly has to do with rapid automatic naming. Rapid automatic naming and visual verbal associative learning both are significant predictors of reading ability, especially in both younger and older children with reading disorder. So we administered the naming speed subtest from the WISC-5 as well as the symbol translation subtest. Notice that her naming speed, her scores for naming speed, both literacy and quantity, are within the average range. So essentially, when you're thinking about her ability to look at letters and to name, to quickly retrieve from long-term memory the phonological code associated with letters and quantities, she was able to do that. When we looked at her ability to learn a visual association presented with a visual stimulus, an associated phonological code, she was able to learn and remember those visual verbal associations in both in the near term, the immediate condition, as well as 20 to 30 minutes later. Both rapid naming and visual verbal associative learning require the child to quickly store the information that he or she is seeing and then to retrieve from long-term memory or from short-term memory in the immediate condition the phonological code. And notice that for storage and retrieval, her score is again within the average range. She also did well on a rapid naming task on the KTA-3. Again, her standard score pretty consistent with her scores for rapid automatic naming and visual verbal associative learning. So again, she is able to register and retrieve visual verbal associations, and she was able to do so with relative speed. So to summarize her cognitive abilities then, what might you view as her cognitive strengths? Certainly, I think fluid reasoning, right? So she's able to abstract conceptual information from visual details. She's able to effectively apply that knowledge. She's also able on processing speed to rapidly identify visual information, and on vocabulary she demonstrated a good breadth of knowledge. What are her relative weaknesses? Certainly similarities, some aspects of verbal concept formation, certainly visual motor skills relative to overall visual perceptual and spatial reasoning ability. And certainly when you think about working memory, you think about her strength in the visual domain compared to that auditory working memory component. Also, when you think working memory, think about the fact that when you think about those working memory tasks, like picture span really requires recognition in order to respond. versus digit span and letter number sequencing that have a free recall component. So it seems like she does a little better when the mode of response requires recognition rather than free recall. So again, think about the fact that she is struggling with auditory working memory. What do we know about working memory and learning? And certainly as you move to look at academic achievement, what might you think about, what might you hypothesize or predict in terms of her performance on a measure of achievement? So do you hypothesize that there will be deficits in academic skills? Again, think about certainly that relative weakness in auditory working memory, maybe that relative weakness in terms of the visual motor demand of tasks. In which areas might you predict that there might be deficits? And then what might be the underlying causes of any identified skill deficits? So I think when we look at the data from that broad measure, the KTA-3 that we used to assess academic skills, certainly when you look at her overall performance in the 3 primary content areas, reading, writing, and math, her overall standard scores are pretty consistent, right? So you notice that her score for math 92, reading 88, and written language 86. So I think when you look at the 2 subtests for math, certainly the basic math computation as well as the application component, scores are relatively consistent. Similarly for basic reading, letter word recognition, and reading comprehension. When you look at written language, it appears as if spelling, standard score of 84, is a little lower than her score for written expression. Again, probably consistent with the information we got from her mother as well as her teacher. So just to be able to respond to the referral questions, is she struggling with a grade level demands in reading comprehension? She was referred because of concerns with respect to written language, both reading as well as writing. And then maybe we want to try to drill down to see if we do identify a weakness in reading comprehension, whether that might be attributable to a weakness in comprehension, language comprehension generally, or might it be related to a weakness in vocabulary, or maybe to a weakness in decoding. So we'll analyze our data to be able to answer those questions. So let me just drill down a little bit to try to understand her performance in reading. So when you look at her score on the reading understanding composite, standard score of 87, mean of 100, standard deviation 15, so close to 1 standard deviation below the mean. That composite score is made up of a reading comprehension subtest and a reading vocabulary subtest. So it appears as if her reading comprehension certainly toward the lower end of the average range, reading vocabulary around the 18th percentile. But let's see if we might be able to get a better understanding of her reading comprehension by looking at some of the sub-skills that we know are foundational to reading comprehension. So I want to know, is it language proper? Is it a comprehension issue? Well, in order to answer that question, maybe I need to change the modality from reading to listening and focus on her performance using that modality-specific presentation. And notice that her score is 108 for listening comprehension on the KTA-3 compared to 92 for reading comprehension. But it appears from that 108 that she has appropriate listening comprehension skills for everyday language. so she should be able to follow directions, but we wanted to drill down a little deeper to get a better understanding of listening comprehension of receptive language. And so we administered 3 subtests from the Receptive Language Index from Cell 5. Notice her ability to follow directions within the average range. Certainly for word classes, we asked her to choose 2 words that go together based either on similar meaning or similar function or similar place. Notice her score was at the 37th percentile. And then when we looked at semantic relationships, on that particular subtest, she had to interpret sentences that made comparisons, or maybe she had to identify a location or direction, and notice that her score was at about the 25th percentile. So it appears as if she does demonstrate a relative weakness in depth of word knowledge, and especially conceptual relationships, especially as concepts become more and more abstract. So again, think about that qualifying information with respect to listening comprehension. And then might her weakness in reading comprehension be because she doesn't know what the words mean when she's reading? Certainly on WISC-5, she demonstrated good word knowledge. Her performance was lower on reading vocabulary. Again, when you think about the different demands of these tasks, I am asking her the questions on WISC-5 vocabulary. She's telling me the answers. On the KTEA-3, she has to read the words herself. But so therefore, might the difference in her performance on these 2 tasks, might that be attributable again to the input demand, one being primarily verbal, the other being primarily visual. So again, might reading decoding have impacted her performance here? I want to go to decoding here in a second, but decoding is going to give me information about accuracy. Before I get there, I'm going backwards, so I want to get to fluency before I get to accuracy. When I look at all of these subtests that we administered that assess reading accuracy, certainly you notice different scores. For silent reading fluency, her score is within the average range. But notice for silent, and think about silent reading fluency where there is contextual information. She's reading in context. Might she be able to engage the semantic or the meaning code as she's reading, and might that to some extent explain the difference in her score on silent reading fluency and her score on oral reading fluency, which for the WIAT-3 is a 78. Notice that decoding fluency, where we're asking her to name nonsense words, words with highly predictable patterns. Again, notice that score pretty consistent with her score for oral reading fluency. Word recognition fluency, these are real words, and we're asking her to name these real words quickly. Her score was a little better, but certainly still within that lowered range. Now, when you think about some of the other component skills that are involved when you're reading, certainly vocabulary is important. And she's able to quickly retrieve words from long-term memory to make certain associations. Her score is 99, and she's able to quickly associate a phonological code with a specific object. So again, there are some strengths in terms of oral fluency, but when we think about the oral reading fluency, when we add the written language piece, that seems to be where the difficulties are coming from. And when we drill back even further and look at decoding, notice that in this case we're looking at her ability to name real words as well as her ability to name non-words. And both of these skills are really important. The ability to have a large sight vocabulary is important in order to be able to read fluently, and we know that there is a direct correlation between fluency or fluent effortless reading and comprehension. So if you have a good sight vocabulary, you could read fluently, But if you also have good decoding strategies, you're able to read independently because you're able to use a strategy to figure out words that you don't recognize immediately, words that are not part of your side vocabulary. Notice that she performed within the average range for the letter and word recognition subtest. And let me just say something about letter word recognition on the KTA-3. Indirectly, letter and word recognition is also a measure of vocabulary. As the words on that subtest increase in complexity, the only way you can figure out, you can name the word, is because it's part of your sight vocabulary. So you're thinking about words that have non-predictable patterns or low predictability in terms of the pattern. Whereas for nonsense word decoding, you must integrate the orthographic and the phonological code. You must segment and blend in order to be able to name those words. So again, when I think nonsense word, I wonder, is she struggling with the segmentation, maybe with the linking of the visual stimuli to the phonological code? Again, that's in the back of my mind. So let's look at written expression, and certainly when you think about written expression, just like you think about reading comprehension and you want to compare that to listening comprehension, I wonder about her written expression, especially in terms of the fine motor expressive demand. But notice that written expression and oral expression, her scores are pretty consistent. So you'd wonder whether or not there are some weaknesses in terms of her ability to produce language, grammatically correct sentences, thinking about syntax, and all of those components that are part of expressive language. But I want to take a look at the spelling and orthographic processing, certainly because her performance on written expression suggested weaknesses in both grammar, but it also suggested weaknesses in terms of the production, so in terms of the writing itself. So we want to look at the orthographic processing composite on the KTA-3. And that is comprised of 3 subtests: spelling, letter naming facility, and word recognition. And notice that her overall score of 87 within the average range according to the KTA-3 classification system. Notice her best performance was on rapid naming, that rapid automatic naming of letters. When we asked her to spell and to name words fluently, those were the lower scores. So we wanted to take a closer look at maybe the output demands for both spelling and word recognition, and we administered additional tasks from the 2nd edition of the process assessment of the learner, because what we want to know is it that she is maybe writing the words exactly the way they sound to her? Is she struggling to retrieve from long-term memory the orthographic representation of the word? And the PAL2 word choice will give us information about that. Or might it be that she is struggling with the expressive component of writing, which is the visual motor integrative demand, or the fine motor demand in her case? So I want to show you these scores first, and then I want to show you what these 2 tasks look like. So PAL2 word choice has both an accuracy component and a fluency component. Recognize her scale scores are pretty consistent, mean of 10, standard deviation 3. But expressive coding, her scale score was 6. So this is what PAL2 word choice looks like. Essentially on this task, what you do is you ask the child to look at the 3 words, and we, on this sample item, we will actually read the word aloud to the child, and we want the child to realize that they all sound the same was, and was. And we want the child to select or circle the one that looks right. So they all sound right, but which one actually looks right. And the child will continue to do that for each of these items. So her performance pretty much told us that she is able to recognize the correct spelling of a word. And in fact, qualitative observations showed that she pretty much always knows when she has misspelled a word. So she's able to recognize the correct spelling. But when you look at expressive coding, and this is a really interesting task because there are 3 different tasks. I'm showing you task C, but there's a task A, a task B, and this task C. And each task has the same words. And on the first task, I'm going to expose a word for 1 second. I want the child to register or encode that word. So you have to register the visual representation of the word. You also have to register the order of the letters in the word. So think about the importance of auditory working memory here. And on task A, what I'm going to do is give the child 5 seconds to actually write the word that he or she saw. And then on the second task, task B, I'm going to ask the child to write a letter in a designated position. So I'm going to expose the same word again, and I'm going to ask the child to write maybe the first letter or the last letter. And then on this one here, task C, again you expose the word and you ask the child to write, in this case, the last two letters. This one, the first 2 letters. I mean, some of these in the medial position. So again, you're exposing the stimulus. This task doesn't measure learning, but think about this if you will. This is like a 3-trial task, right? She sees each stimulus 3 different times, but each time we're asking her to do something different. But in order to respond correctly to this task, think about what you need to be able to do. First of all, you should be able to store the precise representation of the letters in the word in working memory, right? So working memory, weakness for Allie. And then you should be able to access those letters over a short time interval, and then I want you to write it down. So think about this task is actually tapping 2 of the relative weaknesses that we've identified, the expressive demand, that written output demand, as well as the auditory working memory demand that's involved in this task. So again, might that explain why she is struggling with spelling? When we look at her performance on math, and certainly if she's going to be eligible for direct specialized instruction under the classification specific learning disability in reading, we certainly want to be able to rule out eligibility for the math, for services in math. And again, notice that her scores are within the average range. But what I will tell you about this is that even though her scores are average compared to others her age, compared to others in her grade, her scores are lower. So maybe instead of 30th percentile, maybe the 19th percentile, the 21st percentile. So again, so relative to her classmates, she certainly is struggling with math as well. So take all of the information together and think about her ability and achievement. Is her academic achievement consistent with her cognitive abilities? And then more specifically, do the data support a diagnosis of specific reading disability or dyslexia? And certainly you can use whatever criterion you use to determine eligibility in your school system. If you're using ability achievement discrepancy analysis, in this case, I decided to use as my ability score her full scale IQ of 100. I'm using a predicted achievement method. You can also use a simple difference method. But when you look at these scores here, I want to look at the ones about which we're concerned: decoding, reading fluency, reading understanding, possibly also written language. Based on her full scale IQ of 100, you would predict that all of her scores on the achievement measure should be 100. In fact, when we look at her score for reading decoding, notice that her actual score is 80. The 20-point difference between her predicted score and her actual score exceeds the critical value at the .05 level, which is 6, which indicates the difference is significant, and a difference of that magnitude is also unusual, occurring in less than 5% of our overall sample. Similarly, for reading fluency, notice the differences are significant and unusual, also for reading understanding, also up here for written language. When we look at math, certainly the difference is significant, but not especially unusual. So again, is she eligible for direct specialized instruction? Does she need direct specialized instruction? What would be the classification? Certainly you're looking at written language, both reading as well as writing. But I think there are different ways to think about eligibility and need. And certainly if we can take a look at the cognitive factors that might explain her underachievement, might that help us to target or treatment or interventions? So one component of an evaluation for a specific learning disability may include a pattern of strengths and weaknesses analysis. And what this does is it compares, I'm going to use this picture on the next slide to show you, it compares an achievement weakness, which in this case I've selected the KTA3 decoding composite as my achievement weakness. It will compare an achievement weakness with a processing strength and with a processing weakness. And here's the theory, and this is the theory that is described by Brad Hale and Kathy Fiorello in their cognitive hypothesis testing model. So their theory posits that theoretically what you expect is that the achievement weakness is going to be consistent with the processing weakness, and theoretically, and the achievement weakness should be significantly different from the processing strength, and the processing weakness should also be significantly different from the processing strength. If that is the case, if the achievement weakness is consistent with the processing weakness, and both the achievement weakness and processing weakness are discrepant from the processing strength, then there may be a reason to suspect a learning disability. So what we found when we looked at decoding as our achievement weakness, and we chose fluid reasoning as our processing strength, and why did we do that? Certainly the relative strengths were in fluid reasoning and processing speed. Fluid reasoning is a more appropriate strength to use than processing speed because fluid reasoning is not strongly linked to achievement weaknesses in reading and writing. We also chose as our area of processing weakness the auditory working memory index because we know that it is theoretically linked to reading and writing, and we also know that it is not strongly linked to her strength in fluid reasoning. So when we make these three comparisons, processing strength to, well, two comparisons, processing strength to achievement weakness, 109 compared to the 80, which is her decoding score. The 29-point difference is significant statistically, which would theoretically support an SLD hypothesis. Similarly, when we compare the processing strength and the processing weakness, again, the difference is significant, which supports an SLD hypothesis. And I want to do this same comparison for not only decoding, but also for reading fluency and also for spelling. And I will tell you that the data will reveal the same significant differences when you're making these comparisons for reading fluency and for spelling as well. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the results of PSW analysis by themselves will not allow us to identify a specific learning disability. But when we consider this analysis in conjunction with all of the information we have from the school, from her mother, from Allie herself, when we look at her pattern of performance across academic tasks, ability tasks, those language measures, all of the data are pointing to the fact that she is underachieving in the areas of decoding, reading fluency, and spelling. And what we know is that in some settings, this type of learning disability is referred to as dyslexia. So when we think about maybe that pattern of performance, and you start thinking in terms of differential diagnosis, certainly we identified on nonsense word decoding, for example, that she is struggling to integrate the orthographic and phonological word forms. She is struggling to do so accurately, which means she definitely cannot do so quickly. According to Dr. Virginia Berninger, when a child struggles to integrate the orthographic and phonological word forms, that may result or point to a diagnosis of dyslexia. But what we also know with respect to Allie is that she also appears to be struggling with the orthographic demands of tasks. So I would wonder if a comorbid diagnosis might be dysgraphia, which helps us to understand not only the weakness in spelling, but also the weakness in terms of the production of writing or the expressive writing, that visual motor demand. So can we maybe come to a diagnosis of dyslexia? Well, here's what we know. She's struggling with a grade level demand, which is reading comprehension. It is lower, her scores in reading comprehension are lower than we'd expect given her overall ability to learn. The comprehension difficulties are secondary to weaknesses in decoding because she does much better in listening comprehension, and we are able to document difficulties with word recognition, both fluency and accuracy. We're able to document difficulties in spelling. We're able to document difficulties in decoding. Both decoding and spelling, decoding nonsense word reading, require the integration of the orthographic and phonological word forms. Okay. So now that I don't know if that's what we'll do. We'll probably have an IEP team meeting and we'll make that decision. But let's say we agree that she is eligible for direct specialized instruction under the classification specific reading disability. Might we be able to glean some additional information by considering the specific subtype of reading disability? I talked about the orthographic and the phonological link, and Stephen Pfeiffer and Defina described different subtypes of specific reading disability. When you think about children who might struggle with reading decoding, who might struggle to name real words as well as nonsense words, certainly that might be a child who is struggling because he or she cannot process information through auditory channels. That would be described as an individual with a phonological subtype in terms of a reading disability. But in terms of the weaknesses in processing information through auditory channels, the dysphonetic reader tends to have a number of strengths. For example, they are able to name real words. Comprehension tends to be good. Again, when you think about comprehension, comprehension requires not only the integration of the orthographic and phonological codes, but also that meaning code. As we focus more on text, the meaning code becomes more and more pronounced. But the dysphonetic reader tends to have good general ability, tends to have good vocabulary, good concept formation abilities, but they really struggle to process information through the auditory channel. In contrast, the orthographic subtype, sometimes referred to as visual word form dyslexia, is the exact opposite of the dysphonetic subtype. These children are able to sound out words, but they lack the ability to read automatically and effortlessly. So this is the child who will be reading slowly, laboriously, who will always be able to segment and blend and able to say the word possibly, but by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you can't answer a question because you've forgotten everything, because all of your energy was focused on that segmenting and blending, that basic reading part of the task. And then you might have a child who struggles with both, who might be both dysphonetic and dyseidetic, and this would be the Wolf and Bowers subtype, referred to as the mixed subtype by Pfeiffer and Defina. And this is the most severe type of reading disability because essentially the child struggles across the language spectrum. Poor phonological processing. Allie really, we also assessed phonological processing with Allie. Her score was within the average range, but when you drill down in terms of the tasks, what we noticed is that she really struggled with phonemic awareness and with segmentation. Again, phonemic awareness is the best predictor of basic reading, being able to segment and blend. Also, they struggle with naming, with recognizing words, and their language comprehension is inconsistent. We believe that this mixed subtype is what characterizes Allie, because when we think, for example, about the this intervention tool for LD subtypes that we created to be able to identify different types of reading disorders. When you're thinking about a specific reading disorder and you're thinking about the different subtypes, what types of skills and abilities might characterize each of the subtypes? So if you think about the mixed subtype, cognitive ability is often a strength. So is listening comprehension. Those were certainly relative strengths for Allie. Phonological processing tends to be a relative weakness. Non-word reading tends to be a relative weakness. So is word recognition, orthographic coding, as well as spelling and reading fluency. So when you look at these hallmark skills and abilities for each of these subtypes, looking at the phonological subtype, the orthographic subtype, the mixed subtype, comprehension, fluency, language, and global, certainly what we know about Allie is as we drill down in terms of the subtypes of specific reading disorders, certainly it appears as if the pattern of strengths and weaknesses that we've identified really mirror this mixed subtype. And if you use the analysis, there are a number of questions we'll ask you as you're using this intervention tool. We'll ask you a number of questions. For example, is cognitive ability within the average range? You'll say yes. It'll associate it with a number of subtypes that are characterized by average cognitive ability. Same thing we'll ask you about phonological processing. It'll continue to narrow down based on your responses to questions with respect to each of these 11 hallmark skills and abilities. Okie dokie. So I think the important question is, now that we have a picture of Allie, certainly thinking about cognitive strengths, cognitive relative weaknesses cognitively as well as academically, what can we do to improve her achievement when she comes into grade 5 in the fall? And certainly we want to make sure that we consider her strengths, that we provide strategies that will allow her maybe to bypass her weaknesses. keep in mind the important consideration here has to be the fact that she's going to be in 5th grade, where the curriculum is going to focus on reading to learn, when we know based on our data that she is still learning to read. So how are we going to program for her to meet her where she is and still allow her to function effectively given the demands of the 5th grade classroom? Well, one of the things that we considered certainly was that when you're thinking about working memory, the distinction between the 2 modalities, the visual working memory and the auditory working memory, and maybe present information visually as opposed to orally to improve her working memory functioning. Still keep in mind that output demand, we sometimes refer to that as an expressive demand, recognize that tasks that require visual motor integration may be challenging for her. Also think about her distractibility. How can we shorten the amount of spoken information and maybe use visual reminders to supplement the information that she receives through the ear? And then also think about her strong oral vocabulary, her intellectual curiosity, her attention to visual detail, and maybe select texts that cover different subject areas. Encourage her to read for different purposes. She loves fashion. How can we integrate her love of fashion, her love of horseback riding? How can we encourage her to read maybe magazines or textbooks that focus on some of those areas of interest? And then what about writing assignments? Maybe she designed a lovely costume and she wants to explain why they need to purchase that for their next play or something. So how can we integrate what we know are strengths for her into writing assignments? Maybe she can use more visual aids like pictures or line graphs or charts to present her information. Again, thinking about trying to build on her strengths and maybe to try to strengthen some of those weaker skills. And then we know that she tends to be distracted. Like even when we were working with her, she was distracted because there was a bird outside the window that was pecking, and she was so distracted by looking at the bird. So how can we minimize distractions during learning activities? Maybe we need to move her to a different location in the room, for example, or away from the air conditioning unit. And then more specific recommendations, in this case for reading comprehension. Her language comprehension skills are generally strong, but weaknesses in word recognition and decoding adversely impact comprehension. So how can we help her maybe with those metacognitive strategies, executive function, self-monitoring? How can we help her to monitor her own reading comprehension? How can we teach strategies to resolve comprehension problems? What about silent reading? She does better with silent reading. She's embarrassed to read aloud. How can we focus on silent reading and make sure that she's understanding as she's reading? And then when you think about fluency, certainly we want to focus on improving fluency at the paragraph level, but also at the sentence level, at the phrase level. Maybe allow her to practice reading phrase cards and maybe increase or reduce the amount of time that she's allocated to read all of the phrases accurately. And then maybe presenting phrases in sentences, again gradually reducing the time to read those sentences. And then for written expression, certainly we know that written expression as well as oral expression revealed weaknesses in grammar. So how can we provide explicit instruction in grammar that will improve both oral and written language? So thinking about language by ear, language by mouth, language by eye, and language by hand. And then maybe giving her tasks that require a pointing response as well as a verbally expressive response. And then I think, and this is the one I think that's going to be a little tricky, because I think writing fluency, we believe that her writing fluency certainly was adversely impacted by that output demand. still we want to be able to encourage her to write by hand, but focus on legibility, not necessarily on penmanship. But you want to, if that is going to interfere with her production, maybe think about accommodations like keyboarding, but also maybe a triangle pencil or pencil grip might be helpful for her. I don't know if extra time on writing tests might be helpful. And then for language arts, I think those are interrelated anyway, but how can you weave together instruction in reading, spelling, and vocabulary so that you are using certain vocabulary words in your reading passage and then you're writing those vocabulary words? Again, think about the importance of focusing on the orthographic, the orthography of those words, because so many words in English don't look the way they sound. And then of course we're always focusing on comprehension, especially because not only because that is what we focus on in reading anyway, but especially because that is the grade level demand when you're thinking about reading. And then when you're thinking about language arts, think about all components of language, the phonological, the orthographic, the morphological, as well as the grammar, and then using language in a social context. And then orthographic coding. We want to make sure that Allie is able to register the visual representation, the orthographic representation of words. So maybe ask her to find a target word among orthographically similar words, just like we did on that word choice task, so she's able to register the correct orthographic representation of a certain word. And then maybe include distractors with misspellings. She struggled especially with the medial, with letters in the medial position, a little less with letters in the final position, but include distractors maybe with misspellings in especially the medial and final positions. And then we said that she probably also needs support in math, maybe providing some explicit systematic instruction in the area of algebra, fractions, time and money, and then especially the concepts, conceptual language, the vocabulary and language used during math instruction. She did say that science was her favorite subject, but I think as she moves forward in the grades, certainly the language or the vocabulary for science will become increasingly specialized. So how can we make sure that we use that vocabulary and allow her to develop those specific concepts? And then of course I think if you look at the actual case study which we included, there are additional recommendations for interventions, and we hope that you will find those helpful as well. I want to thank my supervisor, Dr. Amy Gable, for helping me with the chat box here today. And if there are any additional questions that we have yet to answer, we will do so in a written question and answer document. I included toward the end of your handout some resources. I mentioned certainly Dr. Virginia Berninger's work, Pfeiffer and Defina, and then the PSW analysis based on Drs. Hale and Fiorello's model. And then also I included this reference. I hope you'll find it helpful. Joseph, this book on reading problems, I think really gives us a good understanding of things we might be able to do to help children who are struggling with reading. I mentioned Dr. Miller in terms of learning as a multifactorial process. And then of course I couldn't talk about reading without referencing the report of the National Reading Panel, which I'm sure most of us have seen by now. And then I mentioned Dr. Sally Shaywitz, and then Wolf and Bowers, that dual deficit or the double deficit hypothesis for the developmental dyslexias. If you have any additional questions specific to the webinar, please send them to me, gloria.maccow@pearson.com. If you have general questions, you can contact customer service, and our numbers in the U.S. and Canada are listed here, as are our websites. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you everyone for joining us.